Hello, everyone, and live from Vienna, Austria, it's Saturday morning. I'm Sister Vassa, and I'm delighted to tell you people that we have a special guest today. It is Professor George Demacopoulos of Fordham University. I have crossed paths with Professor Demacopoulos several times at various academic conferences, and when I asked him to do an interview on our little show, he immediately agreed, and I really appreciate that. So let me tell you a few impressive details of Professor Demacopoulos' CV. He is presently the director and co-founder, together with Professor Aristotle Papanikolaou, of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center and Program at Fordham University in New York City. He is the Professor John Meyendorff and Patterson Family Professor of Orthodox Christian Studies at Fordham. He is also the co-editor of the Journal of Christian Studies. His general research area, my friends, is continuity and discord between the Christian East and West from late antiquity to the modern era. His many publications include, most recently, the monographs Colonizing Christianity, Greek and Latin Religious Identity in the Era of the Fourth Crusade, published in 2019. Ooh, the Fourth Crusade, not everybody's favorite crusade. And another monograph published in 2015, Gregory the Great, Ascetic Pastor and First Man of Rome. And I most recently read this fascinating article in the most recent issue of The Wheel. Is everyone subscribed to The Wheel? Look it up, an excellent publication. In this issue, he has this article, Ecclesiastical Jurisdiction, the Nation State and the Specter of Byzantium. So interesting insights on the implementation and use of the canons of the Orthodox Church from the first millennium, with reference to present-day territorial disputes amongst the Orthodox churches. Now, a little bit about the biography or background of Professor George Demacopoulos. He was born in Chicago. His father came from southern Greece to the US to study engineering, and his mother, listen to this, is an American from a small farm in Indiana, and she was chrismated into the Orthodox faith when George was just a young boy, when the family had moved to Tennessee. Now, he received his undergraduate degree in history at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He is also a graduate of Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in Brookline, Massachusetts, and he received his master's and PhD in religious studies at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He is married. He has 4 children, ages 11 to 20, and his wife, Catherine, comes from a very priestly family. Her grandfather and father and 2 uncles and 2 brothers were all priests, or are all priests. She is very engaged in the church. She chairs the St. John Chrysostom Oratorical Festival in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, which her mother ran for over 30 years. Professor Demacopoulos' church appointments include being on the National Council of the Order of St. Andrew, that is, of the archons of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But before we go on to our interview with Professor George Demacopoulos, I would like to remind you that we do have a very popular audio podcast on weekday mornings available here on patreon.com/Sister Vassa. Do sign up. You will not regret it. You will find out in the morning about what's going on in the liturgical calendar. I give a brief summary of the saints being celebrated on each day of the week. Both older calendar and new calendar commemorations also offer a brief reflection on scripture, which gives you a bit of inspiration and faith-based information to go through your day. You can listen, if you haven't tried it, to an audio podcast that is brief on your way to work, in the car, when you're stuck in traffic, or perhaps in the train, or while you're on the treadmill in the mornings. So no longer, my friends, no longer do you have to feel guilty about having no idea as to what's going on in the church's calendar on weekdays. So check it out, try it. You will not regret it. Sign up today. And I should tell you that for the next 15 days or so, I will be in the United States. I'm giving a talk on September 11th, Wednesday, this upcoming Wednesday in Phoenix, Arizona. Look up my speaking schedule on coffeewithsistervassa.com, and you will find out all the details there. And on September 13th, this upcoming Friday, I will be in San Diego, California. So if you're in those areas, do come, have coffee with me. I will be giving a talk entitled Mystery and History, Two Pillars of Tradition, discussing what is changeable and what is unchangeable in what we call tradition. So don't miss that if you're either in the San Diego area or Phoenix, Arizona area. Now, on to our interview with Professor George Demacopoulos. Hello, George. Welcome to our show.
Hello, Sister Vassa. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so delighted that you agreed to do this with your busy schedule over there at Fordham. And I don't know, you seem to be everywhere else as well. So, George, let me get right to our questions. First
Sure.
of all, I'd love to ask you, when and why did you decide to dedicate your life as a layman and not as a clergyman to the study of Orthodox theology? Or I'm thinking, did you perhaps think you might be a clergyman in the Orthodox Church someday when you went to seminary and did stuff like that?
Yeah, so I was a history major as an undergraduate, and I was planning to go to law school, but I was so captivated by the academic side of history that I decided I wanted to study history, and I wanted to study medieval history. And, you know, having been raised in a pious household, what I knew of medieval history to start was about the church. I was very close to my spiritual father, and he was very interested in these things. And so I made the decision in my early 20s that I wanted to be a professor. And
Could you perhaps share with us who was your spiritual father, in the sense, was he monastic or just a
so
priest?
he was a parish priest. His name is Father Dimitri Corellis, and he was certainly and is very committed to the ascetic life. He actually now, or for the last decade or two, actually served as a chaplain for a convent in Pennsylvania. And so part of my journey to get into an elite doctoral program was to have a master's degree that would help prepare me for that. And he and I discerned that the best thing for me to do to prepare for a life in academia was to go to the seminary. For me, that was Holy Cross, the Greek Orthodox school in Boston. And, you know, you can't attend the seminary, at least not as a man, and not contemplate issues of ordination. But it was never a pull for me. Obviously, I thought about it, but I was committed to being a teacher and a professor and an author. And, over the years, there have been many people who've encouraged me to get ordained, but it's never felt quite right. And I certainly, speaking with bishops of multiple jurisdictions, they seem to have an appreciation for the kind of academic work that Telly and I are doing at Fordham. And so they see us as contributing to the church, broadly understood.
Well, that actually brings me to my second question. Do you see your role as a lay and academic theologian, but not as a clergyman, as a ministry in the Orthodox Church? And perhaps you could share with us, George, the pluses and or minuses of being a lay theologian, as distinct from, member of the clergy theologian. And I was going to ask you, you partly answered the question, whether you think the church perceives your academic theology as a ministry, Or does it happen sometimes? I know that it happens uh, in my neck of the woods, that academic theology can, to a certain degree, be perceived as living a life of its own. So if you could speak to these, it's the general topic of um, church, the church structure as far as the hierarchy of clergy go, and then academic theology, which may not have any ordained ministry.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot in that question, and these are really important questions, I think. So let me begin. Do I think what I do is a ministry? I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily want to be so bold as to claim that I'm like serving a ministry. I will say that I've been completely dedicated to the church for as long as I can remember. And I'm fortunate enough to have been able to find a career where I can both kind of live in the world, have a family, a wife, children, and commit myself to work that is of some assistance to people in the church. Whether somebody calls that a ministry or not, I think people probably have different definitions of ministry. Um, there are advantages and disadvantages to being in a position like mine. One of the really unique things about what we've created at Fordham is that both Dr. Papanikolaou and I are now we're senior professors. We're at Fordham forever. We are because we're Orthodox, we don't fall under any kind of ecclesiastical supervision from Fordham. We are just our own thing. And because we are not clergymen, and because we are not at an Orthodox seminary, we have the true benefits of what in the academy is known as academic freedom. So we are able to pursue projects and topics that the institutional church, for whatever reason, would have a greater difficulty pursuing. And I know that there are, at least on the internet, not people I've ever met, there are people who hate that we have this kind of academic freedom, or hate might be a strong word. I think they're very critical of the very kind of structure that allows this freedom. But people I have actually met, like a variety of bishops from basically every jurisdiction in the United States, have encouraged us to do this work. They support this work. They come to our events. And to quote a now retired archbishop, our job in the church is to ask the questions that others can't ask. And we just have a kind of blanket encouragement from the institution to do the kind of work that we're doing and to ask tough questions.
Right. So, yeah, you would say there are these internet voices. I also have to admit that I never met anybody like that. They seem to exist only online, but they say people have testified that these are real people. They have been seen by others. So I don't know. But in any event, certainly one never meets that kind of vitriol, or the haters don't seem to appear physically. But anyway, it seems like these mysterious voices, they protest against the very thematization of certain topics. They most often actually don't even know what was discussed at a specific event.
Right.
I mean, the papers weren't published in many cases, not because they're being hidden, just because it's simply the news that there was a conference dedicated to certain issues. I don't know, be they women's issues or issues of gender of another nature. There seems to be voices that get scandalized by that.
Yes, I think that's right. And it's very easy to be frustrated with these kinds of things. My own experience, whenever I've met someone who, whenever I have actually met someone or conversed more carefully with someone who takes this kind of position, they are typically a person who is coming to this from some kind of history of spiritual or personal trauma. And they just tend to react in rather aggressive ways for a variety of reasons. And, as difficult as these personalities can be sometimes, it's also, we're all part of the church, we're all part of God's creation. And, to the same way that I would encourage them to be more flexible and loving and understanding, I think we have to take the same approach with them.
Oh, yeah. I have nothing against the mentally ill, George. Don't get me wrong. I will only love. Thank you, George. We're going to get to our third question.
Yeah.
You are an expert, as I've already told our viewers, in the East-West divide in Christianity, and you are both educated and you teach in close proximity to and in constant interaction with non-Orthodox Christians in the multicultural setting of the United States. And I'll say I have a similar experience, of course, having been educated myself in Orthodox theology in the West, and at least partly by Roman Catholic professors, only partly, but certainly in the historical study of liturgy. My very well-known mentor was a Roman Catholic and a Jesuit. So would you say that there is a distinct, perhaps Western orthodoxy that you and I inhabit? And if so, are there strengths and or weaknesses of our experience and perception of orthodoxy, as something I'm calling Western Orthodoxy, as compared to that of our church's home countries in the Christian East?
Right. Yeah. So this is actually a really, I know you meant it as an easy question, but this is really a complicated question. We've actually done a couple conferences on these themes at Fordham, and we're planning more in the future. I mean, the fact of the matter, look, historically, yes, there's a kind of Eastern Christianity and there's a Western Christianity, and they diverge for a variety of reasons. It's a very slow process. But the reality is that today, there kind of is no non-Western space. Right. So even if you're in Serbia or Russia or Georgia or Greece or whatever, those spaces, not only politically and culturally, but even theologically, are really inhabited by and in conversation with Western Christian ideas in a whole variety of ways that have that is almost impossible to truly deconstruct. On a more simple level, right, you're asking me what's it like to kind of do orthodoxy in the West with a Western education. And so there is something distinctive about that, unlike, say, what maybe somebody in Russia would have done in the 17th century, although, as you know, the West was there too. So there is definitely something distinctive about that in the modern world and globalism and so forth. But, as a historian, and I'm primarily a historian, I would say it has never been the case that Orthodox Christianity lived in a cocoon, right? So in the earliest centuries, it was completely and utterly in a Greco-Roman milieu, just completely. Everybody knows that. The part that they don't know, that they always forget, is in the long kind of Byzantine stretch from, say, maybe the 7th century to the 12th century. The greatest theological work that was taking place by Christians in a minority position vis-a-vis Islam. Right? John of Damascus, Maximus the Confessor, right? These people are in proximity to an emergent Islamic tradition, and they are responding to it in absolutely everything that they do, right? St. John of Damascus, St. Cosmas, the hymnographer, they completely transform the Orthodox hymnographic cycles because of the fact that they are living in an Islamic milieu, right? So today, a lot of the great theological work is being done in the West, in a Western milieu. It's different than the Middle Ages. It's different than the early church. But what is not different is that Orthodox theologians are responding to the questions of their era with the resources available to them.
Right. Well, I realize that all of this is hard to discuss without making stereotypical, blanket statements about East or West. But what I'm hearing is also that, these are constructs, of course, East and West.
Yes.
And the guest on my show last week, John Michael Talbot, who's Roman Catholic, he was talking a lot about East and West, and Catholics looking to the East, being very open about it. Oftentimes, there's I would say, more of a psychological reluctance to quote unquote learn from the West or to be Latinized.
Right.
So, it's okay if our children go to Catholic schools, if we are enrolled and receive grants from Catholic institutions of higher learning, if we use textbooks that are modeled after, perhaps Handbücher,
the manuals, right?
The manuals that are of perhaps that the Jesuits were the first to think of, or somebody, or our academic schools in Russia, for example, came via Ukraine. They were modeled on Jesuit schools, and that's how higher education, or even any schools, came to Muscovite Rus. Anyway, what I'm saying is that psychologically, however, if we can point out, say, certain rites or words that entered into, say, some of our sacraments, even under Latin influence, or that came from there, this is something that needs to be cleansed, or, our services need to be purged of quote unquote Latin influence. God forbid, that some of the Greeks have organs in their churches.
No, this is right. Actually, the most recent book that I wrote, it was on the Fourth Crusade, and what I argue in the book.
Everybody's favorite crusade.
Yeah, that's right. What I argue in the book is the kind of colonial setting, the construction of a Latin Empire of Byzantium produced the environment in which Greek Christians or Orthodox Christians for the first time begin to self-define in contradistinction to Latins. It's only in that setting when that happens. And what I argue in the book is that that very powerfully transformed Orthodox self-definition to the extent that it has been that way since the 13th century, right? Orthodox Christians, especially those who live in the West or are conversant in the West, will always self-define what it means to be Orthodox in proximity to Catholics. It's just, I remember being a young boy in Tennessee, surrounded by Baptists, and people would ask me what the church is like, and the first sentence out of my mouth was, "It's like Catholicism, but."
Right. Well, they're the better known,
yeah.
Certainly in the West, a lot better.
Yeah.
as in, we're just not known, and they are.
Right.
Well, yeah. So that's just, yes, I see. That's all very understandable. Identity, and the way identity can even be radicalized in a diaspora, right? And it happens with the Muslims too.
Right.
So I guess all of that is understandable. We don't need to go into it here. But I guess, you know what? I'm really not liking this question now of mine, because it's just very, it's a bad question, actually.
No, I don't think, well, it's not, I think it's a great question. It just requires a complicated answer.
I mean, there isn't any clear-cut answer, because once we establish that East and West, especially in a globalized world, these are not sufficient,
Right.
They're not even possible to define anymore. I completely agree with you that when the entire world listens to the same music, dresses in the same jeans, no, really watches the same movies that are not coming from China, I say, you have to realize just how deep those things go. If you want to be if you seek to be entertained by the same, more or less the same kind of entertainment,
Right.
including music, you have very deeply stepped into the same. Also, I would say whatever culture means, it's hard to define as well. But
Right.
your head and heart is sort of in the same place.
Yeah.
And where is East and where is West in that? I
Yeah.
I, I think
And your kind of hermeneutical reference points are all the same.
I feel like we lose our orientation when we can't really define East and West anymore.
Yeah.
Because once you realize, actually, even back then, it wasn't purely
Right.
Eastern or purely Western. That wasn't even geographically the same thing.
Right.
So,
Right.
but there is a fetishization. Is that a word? Fetishization of all things Eastern sometimes
Yes. Yes. Yes.
by a certain type of Catholic,
Yeah.
and I think it creates a false. It's one of those things, of course, that tries to help us maintain our identity, and I think that because of this globalization and because of the sort of that the boundaries are being a little bit more blurred, I think there is panic in some people who want to hold on to something. Uh, and the best they can do, or the easiest solution, is to hold on to an external thing, or to simplify uh, what guarantees their eliteness or their specificity
Yeah.
as
And
church.
I think you're exactly right. And in my experience, it's actually not people born into the church. It's people who came to it usually running away from something and thinking that they finally found what they've always been looking for, only to be to suffer cognitive dissonance because what they found isn't exactly what they thought it was.
Yes, people will often say, if you touch upon issues that have sort of been
Yeah.
addressed already decades ago in
Yeah.
those other communities, right? And people have fled to orthodoxy to escape perhaps those issues. That's true. Very often I will be told, oh, you don't know what that leads to because we've been through that back in whatever church they were in, and we know what that leads to. And that's like, well,
That's like error 101 in logic. That's not the way logic works.
right, right. No, but it also shows that well, if you believe that you have now entered the the true church, if you
Yes.
believe that, then why would you think that this is the same thing
Yeah.
in the church? It's
Right.
not the same thing, because here is a safe haven. It's the church, and the Holy Spirit guides the church, right? Or or is the church sort of this finished product, right?
Right.
That
Do you
that's
have so little faith in the church you've joined?
right, right. So yeah, anyway, that's it seems to be it seems to have been a recent topic in several of these interviews that I do, and I don't exactly know how that happened. Probably because I ask the same questions all the time. Um, yeah, anyway, I really think I'm going to strike that question because I just think it's
Okay.
stupid. I'm annoyed with myself. You should have
No.
told me it was a stupid question.
It's not a stupid question. I just give complicated answers.
No, it's no, it you didn't give a complicated answer. It's just that it's a how can you talk about a question that just it's coming from false categories? It's okay. Don't I know this sounds like it's a little bit chaotic, but after the editing process, you will be surprised. You
Yeah.
won't recognize this the interview. There'll be song and dancing and
As long as no weeping and gnashing of teeth.
no, no. Let me ask you another question to change the subject, George. Today, as most of us will know, there are divisions and differing opinions amongst the various local Orthodox churches, specifically regarding the issues of canonical territory, and not only in the so called diaspora, but also, need I mention, in Ukraine. And our churches, as you know, George, tend to appeal to various interpretations of the canons, or the common canonical codex of the Orthodox Church, which has remained unchanged since the 9th century. So how do you envision a way forward in the impasse in which we do find ourselves as we look to the canons to resolve territorial disputes today?
Right. So this is, again, a very good question that opens up something of a Pandora's box. And so my training's historical. So whenever I deal with these issues, I try to look historically. And the reality is that there are very few canons that actually deal with jurisdictional issues. Every one of those canons that does deal with jurisdictional issues, it only has a horizon of the inside of the Roman Empire, right? They have no concern whatsoever for the Christians in Persia or the Christians in Africa, right, that lay beyond the borders of the empire. The only exception to that is this canon from Chalcedon, of course, which grants the ecumenical patriarch the right to appoint bishops in barbarian lands. Given the context, what they're talking about is north of Thrace, right? And what it's doing is it's saying that the Bishop of Rome or the Bishop of Alexandria doesn't have the right to appoint bishops up there because it's by proximity, it's closest to the ecumenical patriarch. Okay, so again, I look at this as a historian. Yeah. What I will say is that the Orthodox Church has always dealt with jurisdictional issues in ways that mirror, somewhat belatedly, political realities. So the very division of the pentarchy, the 5 ancient sees or whatever, it just maps onto the Roman imperial structure, right? And it has always done that. I think the challenge that we face today, the real challenge that we face today, is that those canons that do speak to jurisdictional issues presume the existence of an empire. They presume an emperor, and they presume that the boundaries between dioceses and between broader jurisdictions, even autocephalous churches, even though the canons don't use those terms really, but what we call autocephalous churches, they all presume the existence of an empire. And that empire no longer exists, and it's not coming back. The political reality today is the reality of the nation state, which functions completely differently, both ideologically and structurally. And our canonical legislation has been applied in a very haphazard fashion to the emergence of the nation state because we don't really know how to deal with it. And because we don't have an ecclesiastical superstructure that can really force the heads of all the autocephalous churches to come together if they don't want to be there, right? The Crete story was the best example of this. Let me turn historically again. You know, no matter who you were, if you were a bishop of a major city during the period of the ecumenical councils, if the emperor summoned you to Constantinople or one of its suburbs to come for an ecumenical gathering or what might lead to an ecumenical gathering, you didn't resist the summons because it came from the emperor, right? There's only one time that a bishop of Rome actually attended a council. That was the 5th ecumenical council. And Pope Vigilius was there because he was under house arrest by the Emperor Justinian. He didn't want to go, but that was the only way, but he was arrested and brought there. Today, we don't have that political superstructure. Like nobody's going to force the ecumenical patriarch or the patriarch of Moscow or the Archbishop of Cyprus to attend a council they don't want to attend. We no longer have that structure. I'm not saying, and let me be clear, I'm not saying the Byzantine model was better, and I'm not lamenting that we no longer have empire. I'm simply pointing out as a historian that the structures that the canons presume for dealing like issues like Ukraine, the structure no longer maps, and it's a big problem, as we know.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant that you pointed out because um, you see, I've often thought about this issue of the vacuum that occurred actually, I think, after there no longer was an emperor. A sort of canonical vacuum, I would say, that if it's a very complicated topic also liturgically, but I wrote my dissertation about the development of the hierarchical rite and how when as you see the demise of the Byzantine emperor and when he ceases to be, um, there is a very sudden explosion of or increase in his in taking on his clothing by bishops,
Oh, yeah,
in his insignia and the symbolism of imperial power and the the double-headed eagle being the power of church and state,
right.
and even the eagle rugs that actually in the Russian church the bishop barely will step anywhere in the church without there being a this little rug cast under his feet. Um, all of that explodes after there's no emperor, and you wonder whether at least at least ritualistically we've filled that spot of the emperor, regardless of course the actual ecumenical patriarch having some, as the ethnarchos having actual civil duties that
Yeah,
made him sort of a mini emperor for the Orthodox. But it's a complicated issue that the fact was that the bishop was not an emperor.
right.
He could dress like one, but he wasn't. So, what to do? Because the canonical legislation was not meant to stop in the church.
Right.
There was no council said let there be no more creativity in legislation after the late ninth century when the canonical codex is totally complete, and we'll have books like the Rudder that will pronounce the holy canons as second only to scripture. Um, they weren't meant to cease to be replaced by other canons as they were in the first millennium. But it seems, like you said, the existence of those canons would be impossible were not there an emperor to force everybody to get together, as he did.
Right.
So, how can we produce equally weighty canonical legislation that does presume today's world when and we've painted ourselves into a corner sometimes by saying instead of saying this is what's happened, we have to learn maybe to recognize why we're in this what do you call it in English, sort of a rut.
Yeah.
The church can't create anew what the church has to create anew, things like just disciplinary questions,
Sure.
even these questions about gender and sort of sexual issues and of sexual, I don't know, morality, in the light of just a changed kind of a lot of changed things and technologies and birth control and I don't know. There's a lot of things that require a certain kind of you know a look at, but there's no emperor, right? So what would you uh, suggest, say, to it's interesting how you said you don't lament that now there's this freedom. um it's perhaps good that nobody has to be forced to come anywhere, but my question was, how do we get ourselves out of the impasse?
Yeah. So if I can only propose step one, because you have to have step one to get to step two, and
No,
I think
first you have to admit you have a problem.
well that's it. Step one is to acknowledge the historical reality,
Right.
right? To acknowledge that um, and to think really really hard and prayerfully rather than just presume. Was the church in an empire providentially or accidentally? Right? In other words, there are so many things that we have inherited from a Roman imperial structure that people just unreflexively presume to be providential.
um
And I wonder if it was some of it simply accidental. It is just the march of history, right? The church existed, thrived, actually grew at an unbelievable rate when it was persecuted by the Romans,
Uh,
right?
okay, listen, wait a minute. I don't know that I can agree with the juxtaposition of providential and accidental, because there's a mystery to accidents, to
Yes.
the anomalies, but sometimes, I mean, there's a pretty simple question in is it the first book of Samuel, when the people demanded, or the elders came to Samuel, chapter 8, I think it's the first book of Samuel. The people were supposed to be ruled by judges, but Samuel is the last judge. God wanted them to be ruled, his people to be ruled by judges, and but they asked for a king,
For a king,
as
right.
the rest of the world has. And he's like, well, they're not rejecting you, Samuel, so don't be sad, they're rejecting me. But all right, give them a king, but let them know this and that. It's not going to be easy with the king. So is like monarchy and the anointed leader like that's a king, God willed? If you ask your question, was that God's will? No, but he goes along with our choice. That's an accident of our freedom,
Right.
because we are free.
Yeah. So I look. I guess your challenge to my juxtaposition is a good one, and I'll take that. Maybe if I was to put it another way, is the church does the church, to grow and thrive and move forward from here, does it require empire? Right? Because we had this period, right, when we had canonical legislation, when we had ecumenical conversations, it occurred in the context of empire. And while emperors, many of them were awful, and the church suffered mightily under their hands. In fact, every single ecumenical council was called to respond to something some horrible emperor had done. But, does the church need that kind of church-state relationship to go forward? Because I don't see where it's coming from. It doesn't map onto the concept of the nation state. It doesn't map onto globalism, right? It doesn't map onto so many things. And so we are living in.
Okay, George, I don't understand. Um, I don't understand why we're asking that question. Does the church need it? Because the church has no power to bring about an emperor anyway.
Exactly. Well, I guess the reason I'm asking it is because it goes back to first we have to admit our problem. Our problem is our canonical legislation presumes an empire that no longer exists. We have questions of national churches as a consequence of nation states.
Right.
And our canonical legislation is not really suited well to address and resolve those issues, right? Because as anybody can look at these canons and apply them in different ways to suit their interests in the current nation state makeup, right? And so how do we go forward from here requires us to think very seriously about what is the future institutional ecclesiological model given the reality of the nation state, right? And what we have is even though church attendance isn't that great in places like Russia, right, on a percentage basis, or some of these places that suffered from communism, you nevertheless have some coalescing between church and state. I realize it's much more complicated than it's made out to be, but you still have some coalescing. Whereas, somebody like the Ecumenical Patriarchate or Antioch or Alexandria, like the very existence of Christianity in these historic places is somewhat in question. And so they are going to look at this nation state reality in very different ways, simply because, to take the expression, all politics is local, right? Everyone's horizon is their local experience. And so we really do kind of find ourselves at a bit of an impasse institutionally about how to deal with these kind of geopolitical realities.
Yeah. one would think that synodality or conciliarity is the way to the that thing within tradition and within the very nature of something called church that is
Right.
built in to resolve these issues.
Yeah.
But again, we get back to but who is supposed to bring them together?
Yeah.
When we saw in Crete that that didn't happen,
Right.
it was really very sad because it was so last minute, that my church didn't go. It was really quite crushing. It's like we all remember where we were. I mean, for me, it's one of those moments, that it was like, well, I'm being too extreme now, but it was almost like when the towers fell, To
Yeah.
me, it was a big sign of crisis.
Yeah.
It's a big sign of crisis.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's exciting though, George, to live in a time of church history when things are in sort of demise. That's when no, but that's when people,
Yeah.
that's
That's
when
when things change and grow. Right. I mean, again, the example I always give is, John of Damascus and the monastery of Marsaba in Jerusalem. Right. They are a small minority in an otherwise Islamic population. They are only tacitly tolerated, or they're tolerated, with maybe kind of rough tolerance, right, to quote an expression of a recent book, and yet they completely, as you know very well, they completely transformed what became the Byzantine liturgy, right, to speak to their new reality, right, through prayer.
right.
And I can foresee a scenario in which, I don't know what it'll be, but there will be some new mechanism by which faithful Orthodox Christians will respond to the world in which they inhabit in a prayerful way, and it will be part of the ever changing evolution of the church. Right? People want to say the church doesn't change, and those people are the ones who have never read anything.
Right, right. I suppose, I don't know, it's also a lot of things have changed just in the past decade, or at least since when did the internet and like social media suddenly become really big? Was it the late
Probably
90s?
10 years ago. So I think the explosion of the internet was the 90s, but the explosion of social media, I think, started about 10 years ago.
Because I think this has consequences that we definitely as church have not really come to grips with at all, have not developed any strategies also to harness it
Yeah,
for uh, conciliarity.
yeah.
Because, it's somehow ironically divisive that we're always connected with one another. Being always connected has proven to be very divisive.
Yeah.
But how can that actually serve, the way community building is happening now online? People are finding, like-minded people
Yeah.
form their own little chat groups and whatever. But it's not happening on the primarily on the basis of, local parish
Yeah.
necessarily.
Yeah, I even kind of provocatively tweeted out a series of questions a few months ago about, one of the things the canons do have a lot of restrictions about are clerics preaching outside of their jurisdiction.
Yeah.
So what do you do with the internet vigilante priest, right, who goes into everyone else's jurisdiction and critiques what they're doing, right? Don't the canons prohibit precisely that kind of behavior?
Yes, but they don't prohibit it to women. So
Or lay academics.
as long as they don't speak in church, but online, please. St. Paul didn't want us to speak in church.
Yeah, yeah,
No,
yeah,
no, but that is an
maybe.
interesting question. That
Yeah,
is definitely, yeah, sure. Meddling not on one's in someone else's territory is a big concern of the canons, right?
yeah,
But see, that's the problem, of course, with the canons, that we're
yeah.
so selective in how we read them.
Right. And they're always, what we have to understand is it's like any civil law. And in fact, there's very little difference between Byzantine civil law and Byzantine ecclesiastical law. they are always reactionary, right? They're not really, they're never prescriptive in a vacuum. There is some abuse that is taking place. And as a side note to a series of discussions about broader dogmatic issues, the bishops say, okay, we can't let this happen. 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 Now, as a historian, what we do is we look at that and we say, well, we know what's happening because these are the things they're upset about.
Yeah. We've gotten this far with the question of how to get out of the impasse. To first, I think that's just a very helpful answer that you gave, to recognize the historical reality, because I think the kind of sticking our head in the sand. What was it that Father Andrew Louth quoted in his article in the Wheel about the double-headed Byzantine stork? They can't stick their head in the sand. So, like, to pretend, even, even the kind of calling the Orthodox faith the ancient faith, it's a subtle kind of,
makes it into a museum piece.
yes, it's and I often say, if you say that we have to be celebrate the liturgy of the past or something like that, being loyal to the past, any kind of claim that we are faithful to our past raises the question, which past?
Of course.
It's a silly thing that to indicate that tradition is something of the past, because it did change. And if I am loyal to, say, Justinian's 6th century rite, whatever they celebrated then, I am not doing it the way they did it in the 15th century or before the Niconian reforms in Rus in the beginning of the 17th century and so forth. I think that recognizing what we have today and responding to that would, of course, be very essential. But I'm not sure we have the tools to do that, because I think in the perhaps post-Byzantine, sort of conservatism in the wrong sense of this kind of let's don't change a thing, because now we have to preserve, going into this mode of ceasing to be creative or thinking, and beginning what Florovsky called the theology of repetition. I think that we've all been raised in this delusion of unchangeability. And I think that it's a bad word or a concept of innovation, that perhaps if one would address anew questions that have been addressed differently before. Well, I'm sorry, I'm saying something a lot better than me, but the fear of change is very great.
Yes.
And not, on the one hand, because yes, we've already discussed sort of the phenomenon of converts to Orthodoxy being traumatized from elsewhere. But yeah, I think many of our Orthodox might also, just because of the disorienting nature of globalization, they might be suffering an identity crisis and need something that's black and white.
Yeah. They need that bedrock, and sociologically and pastorally, those are very real things, right? Those are very real things, and I need to remind myself, when I point out the complicated nature of our own history, that it's not black and white, that it's in fact very, very messy. That can be very challenging for people to hear, and I need to remind myself to be more careful as I present the historical truth. I mean, that's not to say we should hide it, right? As I often say, if I believe in God, I have absolutely nothing to fear, right? There is nothing about Orthodox history that we should bury in the sand. We should be honest about it, because it is our history, it is our tradition, and it only when we're honest about our own history will we be better prepared to face the challenges that we have, because we because believing in a myth, right, of unchangeability, of purity, of this, that, and the other thing, doesn't help us in any way deal constructively with present challenges. It's only when we, read the poetry of somebody like Saint Gregory the Theologian and realize just how messed up his world was, and just how traumatized he was by his closest friends and by councils. He felt at a complete loss, and yet he never gave up. He never stopped glorifying God. He never stopped being an ascetic. He never stopped believing, even though everything he thought was falling apart. He thought the Second Ecumenical Council was the worst thing that had ever happened. And we look back at it and say, this gave us the Nicene Creed. This is the greatest thing that ever happened, And so for my own faith, I find being honest about our history is actually really, really rewarding and nourishing. But I understand that.
But you understand that some people want and need the Walt Disney version of it.
Yes. But I realize that doing that kind of historical work, which is what I do, can be very, very threatening to people.
No, I appreciate that you say that, because I know what you're talking about when you say you have to be careful, because you're speaking like someone who is used to being in academia. These things are no longer shocking to you. Certain people, the folks at home, might be thinking, like, what things, there is what I'm talking about, folks at home, is sometimes when you dig into history, you find out that, there were gray zones, that the church did not gallop throughout the centuries on a white horse victoriously, that it wasn't that the idols fell and were vanquished by the victorious march of the church, that conquered, East and West. But it's not a matter of, I think that when one does study properly and gradually, and has a foundation in the faith that's strong, this does not shake one's faith. In fact, it makes it stronger, because you're not relying on just some set of externals, but through a deep engagement with a gentle realism, I think, that does see history, that does see things as they are, as I think Orthodoxy always did, that is humility, without sticking its head in the sand. But you're right that people can get shocked and also feel attacked, in their faith, as if somebody's trying to either mock it or, it's trying to weaken the church.
Yeah.
And that's a tough thing, I think, for educators. That's such an important thing, actually, to recognize that you have to have a pastoral sensitivity.
Yes. Yeah.
To how you teach things.
Yeah. I mean, look, I remain utterly convinced that doing this kind of work makes the church stronger. But I think there are a lot of parishioners who don't see the bigger picture of all of this, and so it can be challenging for them. And thus far, just autobiographically, the writing that, with the exception of a few op-ed pieces, like for Public Orthodoxy or else Commonweal or something like that, all of my writing has been academic for academics. I've not yet done any parish consumption kinds of books. I plan to, but one of these days.
You're doing this little show. But getting back to the question of the problematic side of the way our canons function or do not anymore, George, I was thinking about how you really see the role of history and the purpose of studying it in our day. One might become very discouraged studying history and seeing the mistakes of the past. But what would you say are the positive, the benefits for one's spiritual growth, and also of our strength as church of studying history? Tell us the positive benefit.
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is what's really in it for me, right? When I was younger, I thought, oh, I'm going to learn the history, and I'm going to prove this, and I'm going to prove that, and oh my God, that was the absolute worst way to approach the history of the church, right? What I've come to see just by reading and reading and reading is that there are these moments and there are these figures in very different historical circumstances who um, who are challenged, they're threatened, their lives are turned upside down, and yet they have this unbelievable faith, and they thank God. They welcome the people who are terrible to them. They're generous to everybody, and sometimes they're not, right? And I think one of the things that you learn by studying history carefully, critically, objectively, is that nobody in the past was perfect. Everybody in the past was kind of broken. Everybody suffered. Everybody, the very same things that we feel and fear and feel down about and feel excited about and feel energized about, you know, the saints of the past, they were like us in those ways, right? They would get depressed, they would be disheartened, they would be frustrated, and yet there were things, there were reasons in their life to have their faith continue and grow and transform and emerge and encourage. And what I love about studying history is finding these episodes and lifting them up. And one of the things I love about history is to show, to recover and explore the incredible diversity within our church, linguistic, cultural, sociological, political, and to see that, to lift these things up as models for thinking about the complexities of living in a pluralistic world today. You know, the church has never been fully ascendant. The church has never been unchallenged, and the church has never been one thing. I mean, it's been the body of God. That's one thing, right? But it's always been made up of a variety of different people with different gifts and challenges. And anyway, this is why I get animated and excited about history.
Yes, I think there could be, thanks for that very eloquent answer, George. I think that it can relativize some of the, relativize some of the externals that might be dogmaticized, by people with really a dearth of historical knowledge. Think, the specific ways in which we might be doing something today maybe aren't necessary to be done that way. Whatever we're talking about. But, when we see that something's not working, say certain structures, or even our bishops can't agree on some basics about territory, which shouldn't be a focus, right? If that's a focus, are we really focused on?
Yeah, and I would actually look at that in two ways. One, I would agree with you, like, why in the world are we focused on this, right? And B, I would say it has always been thus, right? And I actually take great consolation in that. Like, whenever people get really bent out of shape about this happened or that happened or whatever, I say, look, we sent John Chrysostom to his death in exile and we survived it. Right? Constantinople was lost. Jerusalem was lost in the 7th century, right? The church has survived all of these things. And there's never a reason not to be hopeful, right? This is what it means to be a Christian, to have hope in the resurrection, right? Everything else is...
Right. And to be carrying a cross.
Yeah, sure.
At the cross, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
In Christ. So yeah, thank you for chatting with us and sharing of yourself, about this really exciting topic of history and of how it helps us not to be, I think, discouraged and limited to the present day. Is there anything else you would like to say in conclusion to our viewers?
I would just like to say thank you for the incredible work you're doing. I love the show. Everybody I know loves the show, and it's a wonderful thing.
Oh, thanks for saying that. That's
Yeah.
really nice of you. All right. Thank you. I'm saying
Okay.
goodbye to everybody and see you all, my beloved Zillions, next
Yeah.
week. Do sign on to my morning coffee show. You will enjoy it. Satisfaction guaranteed. Bye, everyone.